let's just start with prayer. Remembering the significance of this day for our country, and to pray for all those families and groups of people, organizations who were very much touched because of their experience of being at the World Trade Center or Shanksville or the Pentagon. So we pray. Lord our God, we praise you and bless you for your continuing care of us. And we ask that you touch the hearts of all those who are involved with the aftermath of the tragedies of this day. And we ask you to strengthen their families and console their hearts at the loss of their loved ones, and fill them with hope of the promise of eternal life. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen. All right, here we are. So, this class came about one time when Marge White called me and said, asked really, was I thinking about coming to Cleveland? And I said, well, everything's kind of up in the air here at Bartlett, and went like that. And she said, well, I would like if something was done in terms of our Franciscan resources, and to expose more and more sisters to Francis and Clare's writings. So then, at one of the meetings of the Franciscan Forum, Judith Wood asked me to develop a course that could be given. And I'm just giving you that initial paper so you see how it was born. Can you just pass them around? Thank you, Sam. So this is really what I gave to Judith for her to pass on to the Central Board, and so this is how this came to be. I start with the text always when I do anything with Franciscan studies, because I have the conviction that Cajetan Esser, the late Cajetan Esser, who was one of the foremost Franciscan scholars, said that we cannot know Francis and Clare unless we know their writings. It's not enough to know stories about them. And you know that it's pretty clear even about getting to know someone we're with. You don't know unless you hear from them who they are. And we get that from what they emphasize in their lives, what's important. And so in Franciscan studies, this is just not my idea, but that the writings have pride of place far beyond stories, because stories are secondhand knowledge. And we want, in emphasizing the writings, letting Francis and Clare speak to us directly, as direct as it can be with someone who lived many years ago. So I'm not going to go through this, but you see all the major writings of Francis. There's another writing there towards the bottom of the page. It says, The Sacred Exchange, and that is considered a Franciscan classic. It's an allegory. You know the story of Francis and Lady Poverty. And here's the story. That's what this story is, the sacred exchange. They used to talk about Francis marrying Lady Poverty, but that's not the case here. she comes to see the friars because they're promising her that they'll be faithful. And in the story she says, oh yeah, that's what everybody else told me. And they fled. They fled. If you look at the history of poverty, voluntary poverty, gospel poverty, she was deserted. So they say, no, 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 this is different. We'll be different. And she says, well, show me. She wants to see evidence of their commitment. And they take her up to the high mountain, and she gets a panoramic view of where they are staying. And she says, how wonderful. I see no refectory. I see no cushions. I see no beds. I see none of these things. And they point to the whole panorama and say, this lady is our cloister. So they give her something to eat on a plate that's cracked and a mug that has some nicks in it, and yet they rejoice. So this is an allegory, and it had a profound effect on the early Franciscans. So that's another one of the writings we would take for those who want to persevere for all these texts. And then Claire's life and her, I'm sorry, it should be letters, because she wrote, we have 5 letters, 4 to Agnes of Prague, and 1 to Ermentrude of Bruges. And then we have her, we have a letter from her sister Agnes, Agnes of Assisi, to Claire, because Agnes of Assisi was sent to Monticelli, which is near Florence, because a group of sisters wanted to become members of the Poor Clares. And then, of course, Claire's testament, her final look. So that's what we're going to be doing. Just to, you'll see that this really was prepared. But what I want to do first, before we get into one of the writings, is to give you a chronology of Francis's life, because we can have a little refresher. So I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these dates, but just to go through them, because this is really representing the context of where Francis was living. I have, when we deal with Claire, I have Claire's chronology for you, but we're doing Francis now. So we know that the date for his birth is debated, 1181 or 1182. He was baptized in the Cathedral of San Rufino, and I know that some of you have gone on the Franciscan pilgrimage program, so I'm sure you had gone to see the baptistry where Francis was buried. We know also that his mother named him after John the Baptist. And when Pietro returned from going to France for materials for his shop, his textile shop, fabric shop, he did not like the name that his mother had given. And so he says he will be known as Francesco. And it was because Pietro did not wanting his firstborn son to be associated with someone who was out like a wild man living in the desert, having sackcloth on and just eating whatever was before him. So he then said it should be Francesco. So that's the reasoning behind it. Francis then, his education took place at the parish church of San Giorgio. It was in the town at that time. It's where the Basilica of Santa Chiara is now, and the one section was the parish church. And his education for reading, writing, all of that came from using the scriptures. So his parish priest was the teacher. Yeah. So I just have Claire's birth there. 1193, she's born into a renowned family of nobility. Her father was one of 7 knights. Her mother, we don't know about her educational background or her nobility. There's not a lot written about that. But she was certainly a woman who was on fire with her faith. She made several pilgrimages to the Holy Land, to Compostela, to other shrines within Italy, St. Michael of Gargano, all these more local places. But in order to do that, you had to be pretty committed to make these pilgrimages, because it was all the usual travels, unusual travels, and the travels in medieval time were very challenging. There were no superhighways, expressways, or anything like it. So, okay, the first really important dates then come up 1199 to 1200, and that is the beginning of the civil war in Assisi between the maggiores, the rich people, the nobility, and the minores, the middle class and poor people of Assisi. And we know that Francis was imprisoned. He was caught in the Battle of Callistrata. That could not, Assisi was, why they engaged with Perugia, which was a city that was bigger, had more resources, and certainly had a more well-trained army. So he was in a subterranean prison. So we think that that's where he started having health problems that his family found out when his father ransomed him. And then he then begins his own struggle, because while he's in prison, he suffers his first bout of disillusionment from what he thought being a knight would be, because that was the aim. His father outfitted him for war, and he had the best of everything in terms of medieval times, and so he was unprepared for defeat. But nevertheless, in prison, the biographies tell us he was somebody who could handle it. He was not morose, but tried to cheer up the other prisoners. They wondered why he was taking it so well, but that was Francis, his temperament and personality. Of course, Assisi was really supported by the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and he favored the city because it was on a good trade route up north through Italy and into France. And Perugia supported the papal forces because they did not trust Barbarossa and his tyrannical land grabbing. He wanted more and more power, and he was really in this battle to fight the papal forces. So that's where that comes. So Francis's father ransoms him in 1203, and usually in dating Francis's conversion process, they date it at 1202 to 1203, and 1203 That's not the end of it. It extends all the way into 1208. So this should fill us with a lot of courage and hope, because if we're trying to be converted, being sensitive to the opportunities of ongoing conversion, then we can look to Francis in hope, because his experience spanned those years. So late in 1204, he's already recovered somewhat, pretty much, from the illnesses, and he's still longing for the glory of knighthood. That's what he was really after. And that's why this is considered an important point in his conversion, because he again has to reevaluate. But he's not quite ready to go all the way. It's the human story. We're not always ready to go the way. So, but he's helping out in his father's shop, and then he hears that Walter of Brienne, who is a knight who was never unsuccessful, and he's leading a group to fight with the papal forces. So this is now another challenge, because Assisi isn't fighting with the papal forces. But because Walter of Brienne was so successful, Francis wanted to go with him. He figured he's not going to lose. You know? So he's as all of us do, we have to really come to terms with what we value for ourselves. You know, are we seeking glory? Do we want to make a name for ourselves? Do we want to be successful? All these questions come up, you know. Or do we lack the courage to do something, to change something about ourselves? So he then goes with Walter of Brienne, and on the way to Apulia, they stop and rest. And he has a vision, and he hears a voice, and the voice says, "Go back to Assisi, go home." Now he's a 20-year-old male. He doesn't want to go back, really, because what are they going to say? They're going to say he's a coward. And those who look at medieval history know that there is a leitmotif working through historical stories about Francis, where it's showing that he was really seeking glory. He had not yet thought of doing anything for the Lord or anybody else. He's a rich man's son. He has resources available to him that many never knew about. You know, they say, you know, when young people wanted a party, they would contact Francis. You know, come on, you can do it. You've got the resources, and he does. So he eventually, he was involved with a group of dancers, and they performed, and they also enjoyed themselves. But he's now has to think, you know, and the voice says, "Whom do you want to serve? The Lord or the servant?" And he immediately responds, "The Lord." So he has to go back. Now, is it the Lord, our Lord, or is it a Lord in an army or something? It's not clear yet. We can't rush the human process. He's really struggling. So, but he heard it's going to be revealed in Assisi. So his gradual conversion is starting. And he generously gives to the poor, and we know he embraced the leper, and that is the only bit of personal information we get in all of Francis's writings, his meeting with the leper. It's at the beginning of the Testament. So at the end of his life, when he's trying to hold things together in the community, which is in shambles, because they're fighting over poverty, they're fighting over their place in society, in the church. You know, why can't we be monastic? You know, everybody knows them. They get big donations. We're getting nothing. So we look at Francis and we see that he's undergoing something crucial. It's going to change him forever. And the leper was, of course, one of the big. He had gone to the caves, he had to pray to abandoned churches, but it was these experiences that God puts in his life. It doesn't happen by accident that he meets the leper. And in Bonaventure's biography, Bonaventure suggests that the leper was Christ. So, and in that moment of meeting the leper, his heart is being changed. And he knows that something's happening to his heart. And he has to really struggle with that. The Lord is trying to open him up because he admits that even the sight of lepers nauseated him. He wanted nothing to do with that. Now, I lived for 12 years in the inner city, and the practice we had was to sometimes take in street people. So we had one who was there for long term, Al Nix. I think Diane knows him, yes. He was a grubby person. He smelled like anything. The first time that the friars brought him in, and we had to clean him up. And his toes and his fingers were affected by he had frostbite. He lost fingers. He lost toes. There I was as a young sister, not even in final vows. And I had a hard time. And I had a hard time because my father's older brother was an alcoholic who died on the streets. And I was afraid as a child. Now, my mother and father were very gracious to my Uncle Jim. My father would clean him up. My mother would wash clothes. They had clothes for him. They'd give it to him. But it was scary for me. So then when we took in people, and later, we took in some women, it was difficult. But it was the best thing that could have happened to me. Because I had to face the hardness of my heart toward others. And that was a grace that changed me in many ways. So it was for Francis. His heart was changing. That's why in his writings, throughout his writings, more than 40 times he talks about the heart. Because what does Jesus say? Whatever comes out of us from our hearts, that's really what's important to us. So how do we do that? So he's now more sensitive to people in need. So the Lord is continually providing opportunities. Now, Francis, at this same time, I neglected to put that in there, in 1205, he goes to Rome. He goes to Rome because He didn't get it clear. He wanted it very definite. He wanted a definite direction, and it didn't come. It just had these experiences. So he wanted to go to Rome. He said, surely at the tomb of St. Peter, it'll come to me. Then he goes to Rome. He gets there, and he hears people coming out of the church. And there are all kinds of beggars and other people around outside the church. And the people coming out who were there inside, the pious ones, they're coming out and they're saying, oh, look at these lazy guys here. Why don't they, same thing we say. Why don't they get a job? Get on with it. He was struck by that. How can they be so pious in the church and treat people so badly outside the church? So he again, what does he do? What does he do? You remember this?
Sure.
What does he do? Okay, tell us.
He exchanges clothes with
He exchanges clothes with one of the beggars. He wants to know how they're feeling. And he then changes clothes. And why does he do it there in Rome? Why didn't he think of that in Assisi? Because it wasn't yet time. And in Rome, he wasn't known. Everybody knew him in Assisi. So maybe a lack of courage to do it in Assisi. But in Rome, he's in the midst of all these people who don't know him. He takes off his clothes, exchanges them with the beggar, and then goes inside the church. And there he again begins to see more about what poor people suffer. And so he changes. He's changing. Then he continues on all these things. And at the church of San Damiano, crucifix is here, he hears, "Go repair my house, which, as you see, is falling completely in ruin." Ha! He now knows. He thinks he knows. And he makes a typical middle-class decision. I'm going to get this cloth from my father's shop and sell it. And then I'll have money to rebuild the church. Wow, it's going to be good. Nothing good happens without personal cost. And this isn't personal cost, it's Pietro's cloth. Francis sells the cloth at Foligno, another city where he's not known. He moves about, sells the cloth, comes back with the money and gives it to the parish priest. And the parish priest throws it out the window. He says, I'm not taking this. I know what your father is like. And he's going to come here and demand it from me. So he doesn't take it. He doesn't take it. So Francis now doesn't have the cloth and doesn't have the money from the cloth. And so he struggles. He struggles. Pietro is enraged, and then we know has a court case against Francis, an ecclesial court case, because now Francis is thinking differently. He's having an experience of God's providential care for himself. And so he doesn't go when the ordinary lawful law and order people come for him. He doesn't go because he says, I'm not under that law anymore. And so when Pietro then takes the next step and gets Bishop Guido to get him before him, And before Guido can say, yes, you gotta give this back, you gotta pay your father back, Francis then takes his clothes off, and he then lays them at the feet of Pietro, and he says, now I say, our Father who art in heaven. So he abandons Pietro, his family, his inheritance, because he's the firstborn son, and it could have all gone to him. Now he has nothing except his trust in divine providence. He then sets about, we know he spent some time working in a kitchen of Benedictine monks. But then he realizes that's not it. And he then goes and nurses the lepers around Assisi. And we know that the lepers were, on what Pope Francis would say, the peripheries of Assisi, and he wanted to be with them. And he then later makes it part of the novitiate to nurse the lepers. That's something that every novice had to do. That was their entry into the community. And he begs for stones to repair the churches. And we know from the biographies, he said 2 prayers for 2 stones. So he made a deal with people. He never gave up his sense of business. You give me something, I'll give you something. Okay, so he is in 1208. He desires to follow Christ fully. And he then, in 1208, is in the church of St. Matthias. And the gospel is from Matthew 10. Take nothing on your journey, preach as you go, don't have coppers in your belt or shoes on your feet. And this is where he exclaims, this is what I want, this is what I seek, this is what I long to do with all my heart. And that gospel then becomes the key to understanding, one of the keys for understanding Francis's writings, especially the rule. So Matthew 10, just as we know now from Vatican II, when we were told to go back to the sources of our charism. And we know from the Benedictines that they have as the core text Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4. They shared all things in common, and they had a common pot, and they had resources available. For us as Franciscans, take nothing on your journey. So we have to keep that in mind. It's not that we're doing the same thing as Francis. No, we're not. Claire did not do the same thing as Francis. And we have to look how to translate the writings, what Francis says in his writings, what values are there that can be translated into our life today. That's why so many people came, lay people came, and they wanted to follow Christ the way the friars were. And so Francis directs them, live the gospel, follow in his footsteps, follow the poor Christ, because he has the vision of the poor Christ at the center of his life. So, then He writes the rule. I shouldn't say writes the rule, but he really compiles biblical texts that guided them. And so when with Francis, they number 12, they go to Rome to present the rule to Innocent III. And they stay as their common home at the Portiuncula. It still today does not belong to the friars, it belongs to the Benedictines. And they pay the rent, a basket of fish every year. It's a good deal. Now, of course, they developed that property in a big way, so we have to look at that. By 1211, he decides that he wants to go to convert the Muslims. So he's taking a ship, and the heavy winds deter his ship, and they have to dock at Dalmatia. And you know, Dalmatia is on the coast there. It was where Croatia and what today is Bosnia, it's in that area. So he, when leaving, before he left, he appointed 2 friars, Matthew of Narni and Gregory of Naples. So he told them to visit the friars, straighten out what needs to be straightened, and but he didn't realize that they had not really bought into his vision of gospel living. And they each do not do too much to prevent any more problems. They go along with what the learned friars and the those who did not want Brother Elias, they didn't want such a life. They thought Francis was too strict. So while he's there, Brother Stephen comes and says, hey, there's a big house being built for the friars at Pisa. You better go there. So Francis makes his way now again back to Italy. And at Pisa, they had built a study house. The people had built this place for the friars. And Francis starts pulling off the tiles from the roof. And he says, wait a minute, this isn't ours. This isn't ours. This belongs to the town. So he stopped pulling off the tiles of the roof. But he made it clear, this is not what we were supposed to be doing here. Francis always wanted small groups because it simplifies life. You don't need big pots and pans, you just have a few. You don't need a lot of furniture, just a bit. So it's a, you know, they didn't get what the vision was. So Francis then goes to Rome, and he has this, he knows that the order is in crisis. And at the request, he requests from the Pope a cardinal protector. And we know that the community, religious communities had cardinal protectors until the Second Vatican Council. And that it was to make communication with Rome easier. We have somebody there, right there, who can handle things. But Paul VI then said, not today. We have other means of communication. We have more direct communication. So Ugolino becomes the first cardinal protector. Then in 1212, Clare is received as a follower of Francis. She begins the second order, known as the Poor Clares. And here in the diocese, you have Poor Clares. So you know them. I won't say more now. We'll talk more about Clare later. Francis then receives the gift of Laverna, a mountain. He didn't want them to have houses, but he'll take a mountain. And he often sought solitude there. So that's one point to remember. And that comes up as a place of importance, of course, as we know, at Greccio. You know, he has Laverna and then he has Greccio. He has got two mountain places. In 1215, he begins to preach, and he gives Eucharistic exhortations to the friars, because Innocent III told them to preach to do moral preaching, not doctrinal preaching. So they urged people to convert, and they urged people to love the Lord present in the Eucharist, and to show reverence for the body and blood of the Lord. By 1217, 5,000 brothers convened for the chapter. Oh. Yes, and they grew that fast, and that was one of the big problems. Somebody would knock at the door, and they'd say, I want to join you. They said, oh, come on in. Here's the habit, you can live with us. It's fine. Well, it has to change, because at the Fourth Lateran Council was 1215 to 1216, and at that council, they pointed out that every religious community needed a novitiate. Something needed to be happening, that the process of coming in, and at that time of novitiate, the emphasis was to be on conversion. Not just learning how to sit, how to set a table, what to do. I remember I was in South Bend, and Sister Agnes, who was actually a very kind person, and I used to have fun with her. But anyway, she came and she said, "Who washed their sweater hanging in the laundry?" I thought she was going to be happy about it. I raised my head. I washed my sweater. She says, "You didn't seek permission to wash." So I got into big trouble. I knelt a few days at the table, and all things were forgiven. That was not the essence of the novitiate. And Francis knew that. That's why they were sent to the lepers. They had to face themselves, look at their hearts. So, all right, the chapter is there. Francis seeks for volunteers to preach in other countries, and eventually the brothers reach out in Spain and in England, and they were in Ireland. This is all going on after 1217. I remember a friar who had done a visitation. He was appointed a visitation, and this is now in modern times. This is when I was in South Africa, and he was telling us that he had to go as a visitator to the friars in Ireland, and he said, I asked them when they came, when the friars first came, and he said 1221, and he asked them, he says, "Is that the last time you cleaned here?" Everybody has different standards. So it is. When I was in formation, and we used to go to West Chicago to the seminary for different occasions, we were always surprised that we could come, we could see all the dust on the bookcases, and we mentioned that to, it was Sister Augustine at the time, and she says, if you want to go live there, then you can, but it's not going to be that way here. So So we, obviously, women and men, difference. So, then, Francis, in 1219, we know that before 1219, the Franciscan missionaries went to Morocco, and they were killed there. They were the order's first martyrs. And when Francis heard that they were killed, he said, now I have, it's good to review. Are you finding this helpful?
Oh, my God, yes.
Good, good, good. Okay, continue. So by December of 1224 and into 1225, he's exhausted, and he travels to Greccio, and he was going to. There have been over 800 studies of the stigmata of St. Francis. Some saying, this is the auto-suggestion that caused it. But the proof of the authenticity of the stigmata is the praises of God. He wasn't looking at himself, he was looking at God, and he was praising God for his gift, for God's presence, to the awesomeness of God touching him in this way. So it's such a significant event. So he's with Leo there, and so he writes Leo a little message also. It's on the other side. If you've been to Assisi, it's on the other side of the parchment of the praises of God. By 1225, he is nearly blind, and some say he was suffering from tuberculosis and maybe leprosy. Francis returns then to San Damiano. He's weak, he feels alone, he's got all this tension going on in the community. So where does he go? He goes to Claire, he goes to San Damiano. She's the one who he feels most supported by. She grasps the vision. She knows what Francis's response is about. And so Claire cares for him. And he then starts dictating the Canticle of the Creatures. He's going to go back to it, of course, with the last verses. Late that summer, he submits to a cauterization treatment where they put hot irons by his eyes. This was arranged by Elias because he was then the minister general. 1226, he has to be taken back to the Porziuncula, but he goes back originally to San Damiano and composes the verse about Sister Death for his canticle. Late in August, knowing his condition is worsening, he asks to be taken to the Porziuncula. On the way, he stops to bless the town of Assisi. He is visited there by Lady Jacoba de Settesoli, who brings him almond cookies, his favorite, and a burial shroud. He's laid on the ground, and that's, he gets this. He then dies on Sunday, October 4th, and is buried in the Church of San Giorgio in Assisi. They wanted his body inside the town because there were walls and gates. And we know that it was the custom then, when they thought somebody was very holy, to be grabbing parts of his body. Mm-hmm. They say Innocent III almost was completely into bones because they took all of his vestments and everything from him. Anyway, Francis's friend and protector, Cardinal Ugolino, became Pope Gregory IX in 1227, and he then canonized Francis on July 16th. Francis's remains were transferred to the Basilica of St. Francis, built in his honor, including a new tomb. You know, it's downstairs from the Basilica. He is surrounded by some of his closest companions. They are Rufino, Angelo, Maceo, Leo, and his dear friend, Lady Jacoba, are there surrounding him. So that's the chronology. It gives you a sense of the progression of his life.
Madge,
Yes.
did you say one or two little things about Lady Jacoba?
Lady Jacoba was a rich Roman woman, and she became very taken by how Francis saw or understood gospel living. And so she really cared for him, and she not only provided anything he needed, which was not much, but she also helped a lot of the friars who were in Rome at the time. But they became, he considered her, he used to call her Brother Jacoba, because he felt so comfortable with her. So, yeah. He was buried in a traditional way, and we know that at his 8th centenary, they exhumed him, and to give him they wanted to give a better casket, so they then laid out his bones. That's how they figured out that he was 4'10".
Oh, gosh.
So he was a small person.
Huh.
Claire, of course, was like 5'2".
Oh, wow.
So she was a taller woman.
God.
So they looked at his bones and then studied those bones and found out, that that's when they suggested that he died of tuberculosis, and they don't know if he really died of leprosy also. So, yes. Well, okay. You have a break. How about 20 minutes, okay? So, first thing, you got to surrender your 21st century ideas of what they should be saying in their writings. Don't put on your ideas onto Francis and Claire. You're going to be frustrated otherwise. And you got to know your own presuppositions.
What do you mean by that?
Well, let's say, I say later on, feminism, for instance. How come he didn't use inclusive language? Because nobody was using inclusive language and nobody was worried about it. Plus, it was written in Latin. So, if you compare Francis's Latin to Claire's Latin, she far excels him. She had the benefit of tutors. He went to the parish priest. So you cannot possibly expect that he's going to have something that we're thinking about now. Okay, Francis and Claire are working out of a biblical world view. Okay, now, most of us have been influenced by other ideologies. Feminism, psychological views of the human person. Francis is not writing, or Claire, in a psychological way. They're looking at the human person biblically. They're looking at situations. They were not making political statements. They simply live differently. So you've got to let some of the stuff go. And look what could nourish your spirit. That's the whole idea. That's why I agreed to do this when Marge first approached me. Because this can help our spirits. This can enrich our lives. This can give us hope. I'm not teaching this just as some academic course. No, I never have taught that way.
So there'd be no homework.
You're waiting to find out about it. I'm not going to answer it now. You know how you have those surprise quizzes every once in a while? You know, I came from a family where we did a lot of teasing, so I have that in me. In fact, when I come home to visit, and my dad, of course, was there, and my mom said, "Now I can take one of you at a time, but both together it's a little harder." Okay. Now you can also check with the writings of other scholars to gain insight into their interpretations. But I have to say there is a scholarly consensus on most issues dealt with Francis and Clare. You know, there's nobody would argue with the fact that Francis wanted to be a knight and that he was self-centered before his conversion. No authors. So there is a scholarly consensus, but you have to be aware of interpreting issues out of your own views, depending on what those views are. I don't know. This was written for all kinds of students. So then you can presume a faith perspective when reading these texts. Francis is not writing in a political way. He's writing out of a faith perspective. He has been touched intimately by Christ. And so that's going on in his heart, in his mind. And you can see it in the writings. So this doesn't mean that they weren't aware of social situations. They were. That's why they made different choices. That's why they settled among poor people. That's why they shared what they had with poor people. That's why the witness of their lives challenged others, because people could see it. And if you've read a lot of Pope Francis, he says you can receive a grace and it can be lost if you don't act on it. And so Francis and Clare acted on the grace, the wisdom, the inspirations they got from the Spirit. They weighed the values of their society and found their society wanting. So they lived differently. Okay, but they wanted to give witness to the gospel as it shapes human life. Then pay attention to the places that they chose to live, that they visited, that they went to pray. It tells us something about them. They prayed in churches. They prayed in abandoned churches. They prayed in the woods, in caves. We have quite a lot in Chilano about Francis praying at night in the woods. He was surrounded. He met God in many situations. And he prayed when he met people in need. Then reflect on how they treated others. Who did they give priority to? Ask yourself what motivated them. What are you picking up through the writing? What sense of church did they have? Because you can have a weak sense of church, or you can have a sense of church where you're fully integrated. You begin to think with the church. And that's what they did. And they put into practice what the church was asking of them. And we see this in their, we'll see, especially in the rule, in Francis and in Clare's rule, we will see how they integrated the teachings of the Fourth Lateran Council. They're there. You can pick them up immediately. And then as we work through the writings of Francis and Clare, do you notice a sense of development in their writing? Francis, you can see this because we have more writings. He matures in his writings. He has other ways to say things. Could you name some important biblical teaching or thought that Francis and Clare emphasize? What do you pick up from them? What held their attention? And are these evident in your own life, in our life together? Because that's when it counts, when the rubber hits the road, as they say. Yes, Sandy?
As I pray in our Franciscan prayer book and read some of the things that were written by, did Francis really write those things? Was he learned enough to write them? Or was he dictating those things to someone to write for him? Or I often wondered, was he intelligent enough? Well, I guess he was, but I mean,
Yes,
did
he was
really write
very
those
intelligent.
things?
He was very intelligent. He didn't have the benefit of tutors, of course, as Clare did. But you can see that, especially if we had texts. When I was studying at St. Bonaventure's, we had Latin text and then we had English text. So but we looked, with Francis and Clare, when we looked at their Latin, then we saw how more precise, how the grammar was better in Clare's than in Francis's. So, but he did what he learned. So he has written some of these, some of it. He dictated others because he was going blind. He was weak. So we have those, and we have some that others, like how did we know about the admonitions of St. Francis? We know that the sixth admonition about the good, where he refers to the good shepherd, that a Dominican preacher used Francis's text as an example of how the good shepherd behaved. So, there's a whole body of information about text, just the text. And we are in a better position now because we have all these writings in our own language.
Yeah.
When Mother Felicia and Mother Clara started out, they didn't have these texts available. And I remember when I joined, when I was in high school, and I had, when I was a freshman at St. Mary's, Perpetual Helps to You, Fabia. I don't know how many know her. She was an organist. She said to me, I think you should join the Third Order here. We have the one for teens. And then the moderator was Sister Narcissa Bronk. And she was a marvelous person. And she really built up a sense in us of being concerned about poor people. And we did a lot of collecting of things to give to poor people, to send to the missions. Postage was different then. And so those were the first seeds. Then after I graduated, my parents bought a home and we moved around Lourdes Convent. And so then I went the last 2 years to Lourdes High School. And then also there are a lot of other influences there. And then the next year I went to Bartlett, I entered and was a postulant in 1966. And in 1966, a decisive moment, Father Sergius gave me a copy of the writings of St. Francis. And my heart was on fire. I was running. This is wonderful. Oh, this is terrific. So he says, okay, calm down, calm down. So that really was the beginning. And then I had the opportunity to go to St. Bonaventure's. And then from there it was developing. And what helped me very much was not only the study, but living in the inner city in Chicago for 12 years. So that was a marvelous way to see how to integrate what I had learned into life. So that started it, and it all exploded in Africa because I was doing this all the time there. So anyway, and I was saying to somebody, I had heard people were saying, "Oh, well, Madge is so academic. No, you don't want to go." And I taught this to the Zulu sisters, and the most perceptive one, the person who grasped these things the most, had what would be equivalent to our 4th grade education. Sister Donata, her name was. And she was excellent. She was like, when because they were then presenting it in Zulu to the sisters, because we went around to all their convents, and she could handle anything. And I'd just be there to help them if they needed somebody to help clarify or, answer questions. So that these writings can be transformative in our lives, I have no doubt, if we let them. If we let them. And that's the big question. That's for you to answer. Not for your homework, just for you. Okay, so with all this talk about the writings, we are now going to look at the first one. And the writings of Francis are arranged chronologically in this volume. So we're starting with the prayer before the crucifix. It is on page 40. And after we talk about it, I'll give you a handout sheet that has the background in that for this. So you have there the date 1205, 1206, but as we have now seen that the conversion began in 1202. And so the question that Franciscan scholars raise about the dating of this, and one Captain Regis Armstrong, who worked on this volume, in this prayer of conversion, he maintains that this was probably used earlier than 1205 to 1206, but that's the date that was given in the manuscript that they found it. So that's why it's dated there. And he says, it is true that as Thomas of Celano, in his first life of Francis, struggled to bend his will to God's. That's what Celano said. So this question of making sure that the will, our will, is in line with God's will for us is really the purpose of this. How do we align our will to God's? That's the big question. And, depending on how we grew and what our preferences are, but that's the issue here. All of Francis's biographers focus on the fact that Francis struggled to know the will of God. He was struggling and throughout the conversion process. During the time of his recovery from illness that he contracted in prison, he spent a lot of time in the caves because he was trying to, really focus on what is God's will. His desire led to the unending pursuit of knowing and then doing the will of God. So there was no gap there for him. He had to know the will of God and act on it. And it sometimes is a testing. Some things we think we're called to do, and sometimes we may not be. So Francis says this very clearly in chapter 22 of the earlier rule. So now there's another document that confirms this same teaching, to know God's will, to do God's will. And in the earlier rule, sentence 9, it says, you'll get this information on the sheet. Now that we have left the world, however, we have nothing else to do but to follow the will of the Lord and to please him. There's a certain progression. It's not only knowing and doing, but knowing and doing something that will please him. He loves. He's acting out of love. He's learning to act out of love so that he becomes other-centered. And he's doing this throughout. This is fabulous. This is enriching for us. I hope your hearts are getting it. This is good. Then, in the last year of his life, he wrote the letter to the entire order. And there, Francis has the same concern for responding to the Lord's will for him and his followers, because he has the beginning of a prayer there, and it says, Almighty, eternal, just, and merciful God, give us miserable ones the grace to do for you alone what you know you want us to do, and always to desire what pleases you. Now, this is a perfect example of the problem that people can say. He says we're miserable. He's talking biblically. Remember that. We're miserable without God. If God didn't love us, if God didn't inspire us, if God did not provide for us, we would be miserable. And if we don't realize that he is indeed caring for us and loving us every day, we'd be miserable. We'd be unhappy. We'd be sitting around and frowning. We'd be moping. And here we're on fire. This is marvelous. So this prayer sets the tone as a central concern of Francis's life. So now let's look what he says here. So the prayer begins, Most High, glorious God, and that's how he views God, as the Most High. God is beyond us. We don't have a little God. We have the Most High God, who created the whole world, who's constantly looking after us, who is with us, who makes himself available to us in the person of his Son Jesus in the Eucharist. So he's the Most High, glorious God. Enlighten the darkness of my heart. So we have his first instance of using the word heart. And he is writing in the first person singular, my heart. He doesn't have followers yet. He doesn't have other people. He's writing here in this text, struggling He needs light. He needs light. You remember when they found the letters of Mother Teresa, and she wrote about the darkness of her prayer. The darkness. And he's in one of these dark times now. He knows the Lord is calling him. He's had all these opportunities all along the way. But he's still asking for that light. And so we have the beginning. He's describing how he is in this darkness as the beginning of the conversion process. Enlighten the darkness of my heart. And now, what we pray for. And give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity. He's asking for the theological virtues. And we remember from learning about how the virtues work, that these are not the ordinary virtues. These are the theological virtues. We cannot acquire them on our own. They're gifts of God. We know that, we want to become patient, and there are ways to help ourselves become patient. Or there are ways, we want to be more generous with our time toward people. We know we can think of ways to act where we offer ourselves to do things, to be more generous. Those are the ordinary virtues. But these are the theological virtues. He wants a true faith. He recognizes his need for these theological virtues. A true faith, how is that interpreted? It's the true faith that he has learned from the scriptures, that's celebrated in the church's liturgy, that's passed on through church teaching. It's the true faith. So we have to watch out. Can we distort it? Yes, we can. But he's asking for true faith. Certain hope. He knows something about salvation, and so he says, a certain hope. That's the certain hope. It's true. It's there. He has it. He has that. He's asking to have that kind of certain hope. And with it, perfect charity. Perfect charity. So that we get out of ourselves. We don't think of only ourselves, our needs, what I like, what I don't like, what I don't want. So perfect charity. I'm open then to how the Spirit can sensitize me to the needs of others. It's important. But, he says, sense and knowledge. He knows he needs practical help. Sense. I have to use my head. Hey, wake up, folks. That's what he's saying. He wants to be awakened. He needs that sense, and he needs the knowledge. He needs to have knowledge of himself. He needs to have knowledge of how God works. Lord, sense and knowledge, Lord, these come from God, that I may carry out your holy and true command. That's our desire. That has to be our desire. So that I may carry out, I may do something with the grace I receive. Your holy and true command. So this reveals that he is a person who is eager to rely totally on God. And he knew he could do nothing to disperse the darkness on his own. That's why he's asking the Lord, enlighten the darkness of my heart. So he asks out of his poverty for what he needs most. And he needs the light that comes from the Lord. So that's it. Power packed.
Wow.
Madge,
Yes.
it says in the top part there that, this was taken from the majority of Latin transcripts, and then it says it's been popularized and it's been embellished. Is what we're reading here from the basic text, or is it the popular embellished text?
Well, I was giving a class to the secular Franciscans in Palatine, Illinois, and we listened to these tapes by Bill Short,
Oh, yeah.
and he said this really encapsulates Francis. So he did not directly say, we took this from an embellished manuscript, but he said that this holds it all, and he described it as a kernel, and it had everything in it, so out of this, Francis grows. So it's, I don't know if that really satisfies, but that's about as much as I can.
Well, I think because they said it, it's like I'm saying to myself, well, is this,
Yeah.
his words or the embellished words? And I know when Bill Short does talk about this, he has said, there's the, it doesn't matter about the actual words, it's how you're receiving it that creates that sense of connectedness with what Francis meant. So I didn't know, I wasn't sure where you were coming from
Yeah.
in terms of the text.
Yeah, well, I'm still going by, that, one of the first principles I learned, and this was when I was at Bonaventure from Ignatius Brady, was that a text like this is to be trusted, because it just is so concise and yet can grab you. And it doesn't have any marks of a lot of embellishment. So I trust it. Anyway, so one more paper. I know, isn't this something?
What have you been talking in
Well, we know, of course, with the canticle of the preachers, that was in the dialect of Assisi. So that's for sure. But they did have to use Latin. That's why he had somebody like Caesar of Spire, who was a educated friar, a biblically educated friar, help him with text.
I was wondering.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? It's 12 o'clock. And so, we're ending this. And I hope that you have found it helpful and worthwhile.
Oh, yeah.
And you'll come back in another couple weeks and we'll look at the earlier exhortation and later exhortation, the next writings in your book. So you just have to follow along in your book. And the first one, of course, is what is the prologue in our third order regular rule. And then the second one is the enlarged one, and that seems to have been written when Francis got back from the Holy Land. So we'll look at those. So God bless you, and be well.
Thank you. What do we